All right, everybody. Let's get started for the AMA with David Nolen. We just saw his talk a bit ago. If you're trying to find him later, I think he will actually be wearing this outfit. So if that's, just look for the guy, very buff. Shall we get started with the questions then? All right, so in your talk, you talked a lot about Datomic, obviously. Is it possible to use Datomic from, say, Java or Scala, or is it just a Clojure and JavaScript tool?
Oh, yeah, good question. So Datomic was released, I think, in 2012, and it was designed to work with JVM languages. So people actually have integrations for Scala already. We provide something for Java. So that stuff has already existed. But the problem was actually that we only had a good story for JVM languages, and that's completely changed with the client protocol, which means that the door is now open for languages that don't run in the JVM. We have a high-performance way to talk to other languages. We use Transit, and Transit has two forms. One is Transit over message pack, which is a binary format, or Transit over JSON, which, if you're JavaScript, that's what you're familiar with, and that's how we would talk to JavaScript. But yeah, no. So it's not. I mean, it was JVM only mostly in the beginning. There was a REST thing, but it wasn't that good. But now, the door is open for anybody to implement the client protocol.
Very nice. Just as a reminder, you guys can go on Slido. That's the event code over there, DC17. And you can upvote the questions and add any questions that you're interested in. So next one, this is one that I think a lot of, say, companies and startups are nervous about around kind of the licensing model for Datomic. I can't imagine that there's any plans to open source it, but how do you approach a company that's a little bit nervous to bring in a proprietary database? What reassurances would you give them?
I mean, that's of course probably the hardest question. I mean, I will say that there are companies that can't even name that use it. As a general, what we found is that people that don't really care about the licensing model are either really big companies who are already shelling millions of dollars on databases, and they don't really care because Datomic is pennies for them. And so we never have to have this discussion with larger companies. We also very rarely have to have a discussion with startups. Startups don't care. Startups, they just care about agility. For them, they pick Datomic because they feel like it's the best tool for whatever product they're trying to build. The real growth area, and I think the challenge area for us is sort of medium-sized businesses where people have chosen Mongo or MySQL or Postgres. And there's not really much for us to say other than just try it. I mean, people think that Cognitec's a big company. It's a company where there's 20 engineers and there's 15 people doing everything else. It's a small company. We're basically a small business. We're not out there to screw anybody over. I think we have a pretty good track record with open source and Clojure and ClojureScript. I think you'll find that Datomic, for what it does, is inexpensive. People that end up paying for the license are shocked that we don't charge more for it, given how much it does. And 4 years later, there's still no competitors. I mean, I think the closest thing I've heard of is Oracle. Oracle has a thing where you can define snapshot tables, but you have to define specific tables that you want snapshotting. You have to define the window of the period that you want snapshotting to work. So I think what you'll find is that we're delivering a lot of value for very little money. That doesn't do much for the fact that it's not open source, but to be honest, I don't know how much that would mean because I don't really think that would have much of an effect on the quality of the thing, nor do I think that the open source model really makes sense for something like Datomic. I mean, Rich Hickey is very particular. Even if it was open source, the chances of you getting a commit is very small anyway. It's his baby. So I think that's another thing people don't really understand. Even if it was open source, it would be a very locked down open source project.
That makes sense. Maybe kind of staying on Datomic before we jump topics. There's a question just kind of generally, how is Datomic priced? So if I'm a startup and I'm getting started with it, what do I have to worry about
We have Datomic Starter, which is completely free. I mean, it's the full version of Datomic. You can hook it up to Postgres or DynamoDB. I believe you can do unlimited peers with free now. Meaning, so it's something I didn't have time to talk about in our talk is that while Datomic's characteristics for write performance is within the same basic range as something like MySQL or Postgres, for read, it's actually really great because readers aren't blocked because it's the same with immutable data structures. Anybody can read because you can't have contention on the read side, only on the write side. So you can basically set up as many app servers as you want, and they can read directly from Datomic as quickly as they'd like. So that's actually really great for a lot of the applications that people are building because I think for the typical relational database stuff, read performance matters a lot. Write performance, it's okay. It's not a big deal. Does that answer the question, I hope?
Yeah, it sounds, so I can get started for free.
So, yes. So you can get the full version for free, and then if you want to get support, then we charge for support. The pricing model, of course, is changing now with the appearance of Datomic Cloud. So you may decide, I don't want to become a JVM expert. I just want to click a button on AWS. And I believe for this, what we call the solo topology, which means we provision EFS resources, S3 resources, Dynamo resources, and the box where the thing is going to run on. I think that comes out to $1 a day.
Oh wow!
So it's $1 a day to run the solo topology. I'm pretty sure like the fancy thing, which is the production topology, which is it's clustered, fully clustered. I think it's a minimum of 3 nodes, and the whole thing automatically scales with load, both Dynamo and the number of boxes and all this stuff. And I'm pretty sure that's at a minimum. It must be like, I don't really want to say, but it must be in at least a few $100s a month. But again, that's if you're whatever you're used to paying for your DB. It's not like completely off base.
Show of hands, before David's talk, how many of you guys had heard of Datomic beforehand? Okay, and then of those, how many has built a side project or experimented with it at all? All right, so just a few hands. I would definitely encourage you to make the leap. It will change the way that you think about databases and whatnot. But kind of speaking about the implementation and I don't know, usage, I guess, isn't the storing every version of everything quite expensive in terms of performance and storage costs and whatnot? How do you guys get around this?
So it's not prohibitive. I mean, but, you see these diagrams, and these were published 10 years ago. The cost of storage is it's like halving every year, right? And that's going to continue. But people have databases with billions of datums, and they're not concerned about the cost of the storage. Of course, if you decide to do an immutable model like this, there is the way that Datomic works, there is a GC process because you can get orphaned data, and so there is a thing that collects that stuff. We do GC on your storage if we need to. But in 4 years, nobody's ever said, oh, the cost of storage is a problem for my product. That's not a common complaint.
That makes sense. So there's an interesting question here about if you have a kind of a distributed system, what would you do to go from this place-oriented programming to migrate incrementally over to this kind of more functional approach?
I think what's really nice about Datomic is that it's not that different from what you were doing before. It's just that now you have this power to go into the past, right? It's not like everything you did in your application to be dramatically different. You're still going to have transactions. You're still going to write schemas. You're still going to model your domain. All the typical stuff you do when you build an app, it's all the same with Datomic. Nothing's changed. The only difference is that when you need to know why your function failed today, you can look at the Git commit and say, well, somebody changed that code. You can go to yesterday's code. You can go to yesterday's database and recreate the problem. This generally requires extensive surgery, especially for production systems. And Datomic, the people that love it are when they hit these hard problems, Datomic is there to help them solve that problem. Again, because Datomic makes those, it makes understanding your state transitions so much simpler. because it is an immutable model.
So kind of on that idea of an immutable model, how do you approach kind of the schema evolution, right? Does my code now have to be aware of any state that this schema could have ever been in?
So that's a really important. So I would say that when you talk to these larger companies, but I think that these rules apply to smaller software companies as well, which is that a lot of people have this point, and I think people need to understand this, right? When we talk about immutability, immutability isn't like this cool little hat you put on your head, right? It's something that you have. If you believe that it has value to deliver, then your services must be designed in this way. And in an immutable world where you're designing an API, it's much more important to really think through the design up front, because what you want to do, if you need to change something, you should only be doing one type of change. That's accretion, right? You should not be changing the names of your keys, and you should not be deleting things. And the other thing, which is sort of separate, is that you shouldn't force people to require keys. But anyways, if you talk to any software engineer that was doing this for a long time, they all say the same thing, right? You must treat your APIs as an immutable thing. Your schema is also an immutable thing. Always think in terms of accretion, and a lot of these problems that people encounter, they just go away.
Yeah, I think Facebook famously, for their GraphQL schema, has a rule that you only add fields.
You can only add fields.
You can go ahead and deprecate fields, but you can never remove them.
Never remove them. And people are always like, it's like, when you do this, everybody's going to thank you, right? So much breakage is you renamed something, the front end wasn't ready for it. You deleted something, the front end wasn't ready for it. There's a real cost to mutating your system, right? When you change your endpoint, that is mutating the world for all your consumers. This is not a good idea.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to think about it. So kind of jumping topics, I think a lot of people are interested in hearing your views on WebAssembly and kind of the way, how it relates to the technologies that you work on.
WebAssembly is super cool. It doesn't really affect, the common question is, does this matter for ClojureScript? I would say for the immediate future, not really. Basically, the main issue with WebAssembly is that it's really there for, currently it's still there for C++. It's for these game devs. They want to be able to use mscripton to compile and build their games. Because really WebAssembly is really low level. There's no story for interacting with the browser GC, whether that's DOM or whether that's the GC in the JavaScript engine, right? There's two forms of GC in all browsers, the DOM and then the JavaScript engine. And if there's no story for interacting with WebAssembly, then for languages like ClojureScript, which are garbage collected, that means we'd have to move the garbage collector. We have to handwrite a garbage collector and move it into WebAssembly. And that's not a good idea. But they know this is a problem, so they may figure out an answer to this. Something that I'm more interested in probably is if there is a threading story around WebAssembly that is exposed to JavaScript. And then for the reason that's exciting, if there's a threading model that's introduced, then ClojureScript could be multi-threaded the same way that Clojure is multi-threaded on the JVM, because we have a great story for multi-threading because everything in ClojureScript is already immutable.
And are you looking for kind of a shared memory threading story?
Yeah, we would love to have shared memory concurrency because for us it's not an issue. It's a non-issue. Yeah. It's not an issue in Clojure. It would not be an issue in ClojureScript. Probably the most exciting post I've seen in a while was not really around WebAssembly, but it was around the WebKit team. Philip Pislow, or how do you say his name? He's the lead developer of JavaScript Core, and he was outlining a plan for adding shared memory concurrency to JavaScript Core, which I think is super exciting, and I hope that gets picked up. Until WebAssembly fixes its problems, I'm actually more excited about that.
Well, we can certainly dream anyway. There was a question kind of saying on the ClojureScript topic, I guess, if you can kind of go into how is the Bootstrap ClojureScript story? If I want to use ClojureScript without kind of bringing in the JVM, what is that flow like now? Is it polished?
People use it. So a lot of people don't use Clojure for scripting because there is, it's not a huge startup time, but it's still not small. It's on modern hardware, I think it's 700 milliseconds. But with the Bootstrap ClojureScript solutions, there's two. One's called Luma, one's called Plank, and they're both, I think they start in 100 milliseconds or something. So it's It's much better. And so people have entire solutions around, like their whole build system is useless Luma or Plank, and they're just integrating with Node.js, and it just works. I mean, people use it and they depend on it. So there's a whole ecosystem around that. There's growing interest. I mean, I've been very skeptical that people would ever be interested in ClojureScript, but now that people understand that Bootstrap is the thing, we see more and more people on Slack being like, oh, I just want to use Bootstrap ClojureScript with Node.js. And with tools like Lumo, there's absolutely nothing stopping you from doing that. So if you want to play around with Bootstrap, brew install Lumo and have fun. There's no obstacles there.
Oh, very cool. Do you recommend that people go, if they're interested in getting started, do you recommend that they join the kind of Clojurian Slack? Is that
so there's a Clojure Slack channel. There's a mailing list. I'm active on IRC. I'm on Twitter. There's a bunch of people on Stack Overflow. I mean, yeah, just join one of the channels and ask questions. I would say Clojure is pretty beginner friendly.
Yeah. That sounds about right. There's a question here about, you've advocated for the GraphQL, or at least kind of the ideas behind GraphQL. Are there any concerns around, say, the security of giving so much power to the client?
Yeah, so, one thing to think about is that, the very first thing, if you want to do a GraphQL thing is, I think for a lot of applications, you have this notion of, you're going to have a notion of a session, and you have a notion of what queries the users can run. And queries start at some root, right? With GraphQL or Datomic, you start at some root entity. And the first thing you want to ask is, does the user that's logged in have access to that entity? If they don't, boom, you're done. There's nothing else to do. And then what's nice, at least in Datomic, is that the queries are data. Whereas, I don't know what the story is with GraphQL. Does the query become data at some point?
No, they're totally freeform. You can do whatever you want at every node whenever you're resolving it.
Yeah. So, I would say whatever solution people are coming with GraphQL, I would say look there. Definitely in Datomic, what you'd want to do is you would want to know, in the schema. You could imagine basically having a security schema that when you run the query, you load the security schema to say, these properties can't be followed through. And because the query itself is just data, it's actually trivial to traverse it and say, all these parts of the query we allied because it doesn't match the security model. So at least in Clojure, it's not really hard to get whatever security thing that you want to do. It's not, I would say it's kind of like a non-problem. Besides the high level of GraphQL, I haven't followed what people are doing there, but I'm assuming people have solved this problem. There's a lot of people using GraphQL now.
So there's actually a question here about Ohm as well. It's kind of interesting. The idea being, whenever you're designing an application in Ohm, how do you decide, what's the fundamental principle about where state goes? If it's in an app state or in component local states?
The recommendation that I have is not actually different from the recommendation that React has basically been saying since day one, right? Component local state to me is so if you're in JavaScript, this is the way I think about it. So the reason you use component local state in React is that you got something over the server and you need to persist it, right? So you use component local state. You've made your query and you need some root component to just store that somewhere. So you might do that, or you may use an external atom to do this. It doesn't really matter. For me, component local state is you either need to cache something that you read from it's just about caching. You're caching something you read from the server, right? You could imagine if you didn't do that caching step, you would just refetch every time, but that stinks for performance. But semantically, it's identical, right? You either cached it or you went back for it. So using set state for caching is always safe. Functional programmers do this. You have a mutable local thing, it's just for caching. It's not a semantic difference. So that, I think, is always safe. And the other thing that I think is relatively safe is that you have transient state. The dialog window's open. Sometimes you want to reify this. Reify meaning you want to make it concrete inside of the app state. But I've found that a lot of times there's no real benefit unless your app is we always want to be able to reconstruct the state because we want to debug everything. So if that's a goal, then okay, reifying that transient state maybe makes sense. But for my experience in the past 3 years, a lot of stuff the dialog's open, this thing's expanded, all that stuff that's just in passing when the user's manipulating the UI, component local state's fine because that doesn't really affect your reasoning power that much. It's local. It's local to that component. The thing is open or closed. it doesn't really affect your ability to reason about the state of the app.
I think you mentioned a little bit somewhere. It also affects kind of the reusability of a component if that kind of state and logic is encapsulated solely in that component. So, for example, a modal or something like that, right? I don't have to know about that from the
absolutely. So if you force people to reify this in the app state, then everybody has to buy into your app state structure. Where if you move into component local state, then you have this thing that like has some behavior and it doesn't need to be involved in what the whole app state looks like. It makes it a bit more modular. But again, I'm not suggesting that it's a good idea. You have to you're careful. You think about what you want, and then you say, okay, component local state is okay for this, and it doesn't really affect our ability to reason about the app in general.
All right, there's a question here about how you might recommend someone who wants to get into Clojure or ClojureScript from the first time, maybe coming from JavaScript. Like, what would the procession look like?
I mean, there's an O'Reilly book. The O'Reilly book's pretty good. If you are afraid of, or if you're not afraid, but maybe you're not familiar with the functional thing, my colleague, Michael Fogus, wrote a book called Functional JavaScript, which is actually, I mean, if you do functional JavaScript, he's going to show you how to build all these cool little helper functions. These almost have a direct mapping to the Clojure and ClojureScript standard library. So that's another good way to get into it. But I actually think picking up Clojure if you're a JavaScript programmer is not that hard. I mean, I did JavaScript before I picked up Clojure. I didn't really find it that intimidating. I mean, to me, the language is a lot less intimidating actually than things like Java and the class path and like configuring the JVM. Those things tend to be require the learning curve's bigger. Clojure, the language itself, I think if you do JavaScript, it's not that hard to pick up.
How many people have actually played with Clojure at all? And then of those who haven't, like, what is holding you back? Is it like the syntax? Raise your hand if you're like nervous about the Clojure syntax. All right, so we have one person. Is it about like the concepts? Anyone confused about the concepts of Clojure? No? All right, sounds like there's nothing holding people back then. All right, very cool. There's a question here about whether or not you plan to incorporate RDF into Datomic, because it already has a triple store. But I think maybe changing the question overall to be kind of how does Cognitech communicate the roadmap, for example, for Datomic? How do I know what's kind of coming down the line?
Well, I've already announced at least the next 6 months of what's going to happen here at ReactiveConf. So the AWS thing is like at least the next 6 months. So by the end of Q4 this year, we're going to have the solo topology on AWS, and then so at some point in 2018, we're going to have the production topology, the fully clustered thing. I mean, that's a lot of stuff. And then probably sometime in Q1 2018, I would like to have the basic version of the JavaScript client that I was sort of showing off, the snippets. I would like a functioning version of the JavaScript client. And then, to be honest, I don't intend to use it myself, so I would love to engage with the open source community, the JavaScript world, to make that thing really great for ES6 style JavaScript, for TypeScript, and also for any other sort of functional programming language targeting JavaScript that is going to run under Node or whatever. We want the JS client to work for many languages, and that's definitely not a small amount of effort. I mean, getting the basics working, it's very easy, but making it great for JavaScript, I think, is going to require work from myself as well as anybody else that wants to see it succeed.
So if we're interested in kind of seeing the roadmap, should we just follow you and watch all of your talks, or is there some way to know outside of that what's coming down?
Again, maybe you're trying to ask, there's no roadmap beyond what I said, right? Okay. Okay. That's the roadmap. That's what we're working on right now. Those are the things we're willing to talk about. Anything else is really, we don't know.
Okay. And to be fair, are there plans to incorporate RDF?
No plans to incorporate RDF.
All right, fair enough. How are we on time? Are we okay? We can chat a bit more, or? All right. I just want to make sure we're not going to run over. There are a ton of topics that we cover, right? So there's like Ohm and Datomic and ClojureScript and Bootstrap ClojureScript and whatnot. you're kind of prolific, right? And kind of almost in an intimidating way. How do you manage to kind of straddle all of these things? Like, is there an underlying connective theme behind them, or is it just like you power through and just deliver these things?
I mean, open source is good for delegating responsibility, right? So with Ohm, there's quite a few people now that have really helped keep that project going, because I really don't have that much time. I mean, eventually you run out of time. I definitely have run out of time. So there are people helping out with Ohm Next. ClojureScript also, there's like, I don't know, last time I checked, there's like 165 contributors now in Git to that project, and there's just tons of patches flowing in. My job on ClojureScript these days is mostly saying, I think we should work on this, I think we should work on that. Somebody takes that task, they provide a patch, and my job is mostly just being a maintainer. I look at patches, I review them, I give feedback, and I apply them. So I think the key to staying productive after you're like, okay, I can't just do it all on my own, is to, delegate responsibility and build a community. And I think certainly with the case with ClojureScript, there's definitely a strong community around it.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Anyone wants to? We can pass around some mics if anyone has questions. And if not, I'm happy to chat with David. All right. Are we okay for time? All right. If you do have any questions, just raise your hand and we'll pass out a mic for you. Any thoughts around Ohm Next, or like any developments in that front?
There's not that much going on Ohm Next. I mean, probably the only thing that we wanted to do, but we'll see if we get to it, is... I'm sorry? Oh.
It's not you, yeah.
Oh, it's like, okay, what's going on? Is spec, integration with spec. So one thing that I like about React is React has this props validation stuff, and I think that's great. And so we would like to have specs for your queries so that we would be able to do similar types of prop validation, because I think that's just a good thing.
That's very clever.
Yeah. But other than that, no, I mean, I know that there's a thing called Untangled, and Tony K works on that, and he's exploring something, but I think he has everything he needs in Ohm itself to do what he wants. So, no, Ohm Next is like, it's more or less done, with the exception of maybe this props validation stuff.
Oh, very cool. Please thank David Nolen for his time and for his talk.